Welcome to the fourth season of the seminar. Here is Professor Yaniv Roznai, who is going to present one of his papers related with the topic of constitutional amendments. The paper is titled Democratic Erosion, Populist Constitutionalism, and the Unconstitutional and Constitutional Amendments Doctrine. Erosión democrática, populismo constitucional y la inconstitucionalidad, la doctrina de la constitucionalidad de las reformas constitucionales. Voy a presentar al profesor Yaniv Roznai. Para los que no lo conozcan, ya está por aquí. Profesor Yaniv es profesor asociado de la Universidad Harry Raziner de Herzliya en Israel. Herzliya, ¿cómo se dice?
Herzliya.
Herzliya en Tel Aviv. Bueno, él tiene un doctorado en London School of Economics y también pues su LLB y su BA degrees en Magna Cum Laude, también de IDC, y también ha hecho estudios de postdoctorado en el Centro Minerva de la Universidad de Haifa, en la Universidad Hauser Global Law School de New York, y en este programa que es muy bueno también, en el 2013, Yaniv hizo el programa de In Law and Public Affairs de LAPA en Princeton University, que es también muy reconocido. Yaniv hace parte del staff de ICON, es Association, y fue, digamos, su tesis obtuvo el premio en el 2014 del Grupo de Derecho Público Europeo. Su famoso libro Constitutional Amendments, que fue publicado por Oxford University, que está acá. Entonces, Yaniv es uno de los grandes jóvenes constitucionalistas, es un amigo, es una persona muy simpática, pero muy activo también en todo lo que es en las discusiones constitucionales, y junto con Richard Albert, con David Landau, con Rosalind Dixon, con otros jóvenes constitucionalistas, han hecho todo un grupo a través de ICON. Welcome, Yaniv, to our seminar. So you have 40 minutes to do your presentation. After that, we do some comments, and then we have some questions. Thank you for being here. In Israel, it's like 10 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the evening.
Yes,
what time is it?
10 o'clock.
10 o'clock, okay. Thank you very much for being here. So the room is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Gonzalo, for inviting me. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I hope you can hear me well. So I originally planned to really present the paper thoroughly and read from the paper, but I think I'll just go more natural, and I hope this would be more fluent this way. So the aim of the paper basically is to touch upon two global trends that we see in recent years. One trend is the trend of judicial review of constitutional amendments. This whole idea of unconstitutional constitutional amendments, on which I've written quite a lot. So this is one trend. The second trend that is more recent is the trend of democratic erosion. And this is what I'm interested in. And basically what I want to examine in this paper, which I've co-authored with Tamar Ostrovsky-Brandes, is can the doctrine, this doctrine of unconstitutional amendments, can it be useful in blocking democratic erosion? Can it assist democracy? And what we highlight in the paper, which is really a sketch of some big ideas, is that the doctrine faces three main problems in the era of democratic erosion, and then we propose some modifications to the doctrine, which might be useful to tackle democratic erosion. But I think each of the points that we raise deserves its own separate treatment in a paper. So I'm very happy, although the article was just published, I'm very much looking forward to our discussion, because each of these points we will try probably to later develop into full papers. So let me just start. So now we live, as we all know, anyone that just opened any article on comparative constitutional law in the recent year knows that we are now in the time of democratic erosion all around the world. Now, democratic erosion is a slow and incremental, but ultimately still substantial process of erosion of three basic principles or characteristics of democracy: fundamental rights of free speech and association, rule of law, and competitive elections. Now, ultimately, although this is a slow process, ultimately it reaches to a stage where democracy is severely damaged and where you have elements of authoritarian regimes or anti-democratic elements to the constitutional order, as occurred, for example, in Turkey, Hungary, Poland, and other places in the world. Now, this is a process that has been taking place for about a decade. So we had, in the end of 1980s, early 1990s, we had this wonderful process of democratization, right? We had new democracies around the world that adopted constitutional courts, Bill of Rights, etc. Now, this process in the last 13 years has stopped and is now been declining. So the recent Freedom House reports shows that now there are less full democracies and semi-democracies than we had a decade ago. It also shows the 13th year in a row of erosion in fundamental freedoms. Now, this process of erosion doesn't skip any part of the world. We see it in Latin America, we see it in North America, we see it in Asia, we see it in Africa, we see it in Europe. Okay, so no part of the world is immune to this process. Now, I can later in the Q&A, if you want, have to elaborate on this process of populism and populist constitutionalism, etc. I'll happily talk about that later on, but let's just put that aside for now. What I do want to do is to touch upon some of the characteristics of this process of democratic erosion, and then we'll move on to talk about the doctrine of unconstitutional amendments and whether it can be useful. So the problem with democratic erosion is that it is very much different from what we've seen in the past. In the past, rulers that wanted to take over the constitutional order simply acted in unconstitutional or extra-constitutional manner, right? What you do, you have a coup d'etat. You have a coup d'etat and the generals take over the country. This was quite common until the late 1970s, early 1980s. But now, if you look at Tom Ginsburg and Aziz Hook's book on how to save a constitutional democracy, you see coup d'etats are declining. We don't longer see them. But what we do see, we see political leaders and actors using democratic institutions and democratic processes themselves in order to undermine the democratic order and its principles, right? So what we have a use or abuse, if you like, of the democratic system itself. This is one feature. The second feature is that we are not using extra constitutional means, but we are using legal and constitutional means. This is what David Landau calls abusive constitutionalism, right? Or Kim Lane Shapley calls autocratic legalism. We don't break the law or we don't act outside the constitutional order, but we use legal tools and constitutional tools in order to capture the constitutional order or in order to undermine the other democratic institutions. So this is the second feature. Now, these two features together are very much problematic because we don't really know how to face them. And here, I want to move on to the three before I move to the three about developments, prima facie on itself, if you think about it, the doctrine of unconstitutional amendments can be quite useful if you think about what I've just said. Why is that? I'll say a word about the doctrine. The doctrine of unconstitutional amendments says the following, in a nutshell. It says that certain features of the constitutional order, certain principles, rules, or institutions are so important to what the Constitution means, to the democratic order, that they are untouchable. They cannot be changed. They cannot be amended. Now, sometimes this is written explicitly in the Constitution. This is what we call unamendable provisions or eternity clauses, or what the Brazilian and Portuguese constitutions call clausula petrea, petrus clauses, stone clauses, because they're so rigid, right? So the most famous example, of course, is, let's say, Article 79.3 of the German Basic Law, that says that even if you amend the Constitution, you cannot touch upon human dignity and the basic principles of the democratic order, right? These things are untouchable. You cannot amend them. In many countries, what we see protected is the Republican form of government. As you all probably familiar, in many Latin American countries, what is usually protected is the presidential term limits, because we've seen in the past how bad it is for the democratic order that you have a leader that is eternal, it stays for too long. So we want to have a term limit and want to protect it from change. I'll come back to that later on in the presentation. So some features cannot be changed. Sometimes the Constitution doesn't mention them, but the court, this could be Supreme Court or constitutional courts in certain jurisdictions, courts have said that certain principles are so important to the constitutional order that they are implicitly protected from change, even though the Constitution is silent, like in India. So in India, the Supreme Court said that certain features are so important to the identity of the Constitution that they form part of the basic structure of the Constitution so that they cannot be amended, like secularism, like democracy, like separation of powers. So this is the main idea behind the doctrine of unconstitutional amendments. And these limitations are often enforced by courts that review not only ordinary legislation, but also constitutional legislation. So you can find a court reviewing a constitutional amendment and saying that this amendment undermines the basic features of the constitutional order, and therefore these are unconstitutional constitutional amendments, and declares them invalid. Okay, so this is the doctrine. And when you think about it, in light of what I've just said earlier, that in democratic erosion we use legal and constitutional tools, the doctrine seems quite useful. Think of someone, a government that tries to amend the Constitution in a way that undermines the basic features of the Constitution. So the court can, in theory, say that this amendment goes against the basic principles of the constitutional order and invalidate it and protect the constitutional order. So on itself, if you think about the doctrine, it seems like a useful tool against democratic erosion because it has the capacity to block various constitutional changes. And if we look at the history, I've just mentioned India. So in India in the 1970s, indeed the court was quite useful in protecting democracy against changes by Indira Gandhi. And I can think of other examples. For example, if we look at Asia, so in 1999 in Taiwan, the National Assembly amended the Constitution and extended the term of the National Assembly. And then this was blocked by the court, the Supreme Court, that said, no, you cannot do such a thing. This goes against basic principles of democracy, and invalidate that amendment and saved, if you want, Taiwanese democracy. I'm here being invited to speak virtually in Colombia, so we can all think about the cases with President Uribe and the term limits, right? Where the Colombian Constitutional Court said, no, a second term from president, it's fine, but 3 terms, that's already a constitutional replacement. This goes against basic principles, this would harm our democratic order, and we will not allow it and invalidate, right, that change. So in theory, and maybe even in practice, this doctrine can be useful. So far I've said nothing new, basically. Now I get to the real point of the paper. Democratic erosion, Tamar and I claim, have three unique mechanisms or characteristics that make the doctrine almost useless. And these are the three characteristics. The first one is what we call incrementalism. Democratic erosion, if you look at things that are going on in Poland or in Hungary, with many other countries, the process of democratic backsliding or erosion is never occurs in one instant. It's not a one-time full blow. You don't have one law or one amendment that says, oh, the country is no longer a democracy, right? What we see are small changes, small increments. It's an incremental small process, piece by piece. And if you examine each of the changes, it's very hard to say, oh, this is a destruction of democracy. You may like it, you may not like it, maybe you think it's bad, but it is a small change. It's never a big dramatic change. It's never a revolutionary change. We are no longer in the situation like in, I don't know, July 1940 in France, where the National Assembly said, okay, we are now amending the Constitution to give all powers to Marshal Pétain to establish Vichy. We don't have this anymore. We have small changes, incremental small changes. Now, the problem with incrementalism is that the doctrine of unconstitutional amendments doesn't know how to deal with that. The doctrine aims to block revolutionary amendments. It aims to block those constitutional amendments that violate the core of the basic pillars of the Constitution. That after these changes, the Constitution is no longer the same. But we don't have such amendments. So this is one big problem. So if you like, I can conclude it in one sentence. The killers of democracy now use subtle legal means to kill it, and the doctrine just stands aside watching this assassination. The doctrine stands helplessly aside. This is one main problem. The second problem is what we call constitutional replacement. Sometimes the government or the wannabe autocrats say, oh, I have problems now in amending the Constitution, so I can just, I'll just bring a new Constitution. I'll just replace the Constitution with a new one. The most obvious example is the Hungarian one. Okay, so in Hungary, once the Fidesz party got the 2/3 it needed in parliament to change the constitution, it could have done anything it wanted. And eventually what it did in 2011, it simply enacted, because it had the majority it needed to change the constitution, it simply enacted a new basic law, a new fundamental law, they call it, a new constitution. They brought about a new constitution. Now, here again, the doctrine of unconstitutional amendments is useless because the doctrine is built on the following theoretical idea. The original constituent power, the constituent power of the people, can decide to limit the secondary or derived constituent power, the power of the delegated political authorities to amend the constitution. What we say, oh no, you, the government, you only have a delegated power to change the constitution. You don't have absolute power of the people. So you're blocked. There are certain things you cannot do. So the doctrine is only acts in this vertical separation of powers between constituent power and the amendment power. But what do you do if you now face a completely new constitution that is derived allegedly from a new constituent power, original constituent power, not from the delegated amending power? What do you do? Can we imagine a court saying, wait, this now new constitution is unconstitutional? How can a court, deriving its own authority from the constitution, say that the constitution is unconstitutional? This seems quite problematic, logically speaking. So this is the second problem. The second problem is, the third problem and final problem is what we call court packing. So basically now, governments have realized the following thing. Which institution is the most dangerous one that can block my initiatives, if I'm the government, my initiatives to control the democratic institutions? It is the court, the independent court. That is the final barrier, right? The final barrier that can block my actions. So instead of fighting it, if you can't beat it, what you do, you capture it, you control it. And so if you look around the world, what we see governments trying to, of course, first limit the court, threaten the court, undermine its authorities, but ultimately capturing it. How do you do it? Varies. You have various ways. You can decrease the retirement age from 70 to 60, and then automatically you cut off all the top strata. You can change the way judges are appointed or nominated so that the government would be the most dominant one in judicial appointments, as occurred in Hungary and Poland, for example. And once you've captured, you can extend the bench of the court. You can say, oh, 11 judges, that's not enough. They have so much work to do. Let's extend the bench to 15 judges. And then you automatically can appoint new 4 judges of your own. So there are many ways. And once you've controlled the court, once you've captured the court, then it's much easier to do anything else you want. You can then act more freely in undermining other democratic institutions because there are no other independent institutions that would block you, that would stop you from doing it. So the first thing that the autocrats do or the populist leaders do is to undermine and ultimately capture the court. Now here again, if you have a captured court, the doctrine of unconstitutional amendments, first, it is useless because if you have judges that are on your side, that you put them there, why would they use the doctrine to block your actions? But not only that, not only that the doctrine is useless, it is even dangerous. Why is it dangerous? Because it provides the leaders, the government, the incumbent, with more tools to achieve their goals. Think, for example, on term limits. Think of the common Latin American constitution that says that you have one presidential term limit. Let's say that the president can serve one term of 4 years. So let's say now someone wants to change this rule and say, oh no, we need to, you know what, I'll go reverse. Let's take a different example. Let's say the Constitution now in Latin America says nothing about term limits. But now, since we know how important it is, we want to have an amendment that imposes a term limit, that says a term limit, that says that now the president can serve only one term. A court that is captured now by the president can say, no, this rule, this new amendment undermines the right to be elected, it undermines the right to vote, it goes against basic principles of democracy, and therefore it is unconstitutional, right? And declare such an amendment as unconstitutional. Think of the second example that I started with. Imagine that there's already in the Constitution there's a provision about term limits. But now the president wants to run for a second term. It has various options. One option is to amend the Constitution. But what do you do if you have an unamendable provision that protects the term limits so that he cannot do it? Allegedly, the president, his hands are tied. He cannot do anything. One option is maybe to have a completely new constitution, right? But sometimes the constitution would not even allow that. Think, for example, on the Honduras constitution, right? So probably you're all familiar with this case better than I am. So in Honduras, the constitution included presidential term limits. Not only that, but if the president even just suggested to change the presidential term limits, it would be automatically out of office, right? And when President Zelaya tried to do that in 2009, and he said, oh, let's just maybe have a referendum. Maybe it's useful to have a new constitution. Then people said, oh no, what you're trying to do, you want to overcome the presidential term limits. This is unconstitutional, we will not allow it. And the military came in the middle of the night, took him out in his pajamas, and right, and did not allow it. So this is one example. But more recently, when the president wanted to do it, what he did, he simply captured the court. And once the court was captured, then you had politicians from the government challenging that presidential term limits before the Constitutional Court. And then the court said in 2015 that the original provision in the Constitution, not an amendment, the original provision in the Constitution undermines basic principles of the constitutional order. It violates the right to vote, the right to be elected. It goes against international human rights law, and declared that provision to be ineffective and inapplicable, so allowing the president to run again. So when you have a court that is captured, they can abuse or misuse the doctrine, right, for to achieve the goals of the president. So far I've highlighted the problems, and I have about 5 minutes or so. So let me now move to the final part of the paper, and that is, so what do we propose? So basically, what Tamar and I propose, we propose the following. We think that the doctrine is still important, not useless, it's still important, but we need to think of 3 modifications or applications, new applications of the doctrine that might be more useful. Now, each of these carries problems, as we can elaborate in the Q&A, but we think that these are points or directions to think about. So the first one is to deal with incrementalism. And how to deal with incrementalism? Perhaps, Tamar and I suggest, we need to move to what we call an aggregated judicial review. Aggregated judicial review to consider not only constitutional amendments on their own, as if there's nothing else there, as if I'm a horse with my eyes covered and I don't see anything inside. I'm only examining the amendment that I'm now looking at, but to examine constitutional amendments in their wider context and to see whether they join other constitutional amendments that may affect similar principles, right? So think, for example, I've highlighted the presidential term limits and Colombia and Uribe. So let's maybe stick with this example. Try to think of the following. Let's say the president can serve 1 term for 4 years. Then the president wants to change the constitution to allow him to serve for a 2nd term for 8 years. But then we say, oh no, this is fine. Serve a 2nd consecutive term is fine. It's not unconstitutional. But then we don't allow the 3rd term. But how come? If we allowed another 4 years, why do we not allow another 4 years? Because we don't look at it that. We don't say, oh, okay, now we have an amendment that says +4. It's fine. Because what we take in mind is the previous amendments. This is not just +4. In the Uribe case, what I'm claiming is basically what we do, what the Colombian Constitutional Court did. It examined that change in a broader context. It didn't examine just a single another consecutive term, but it looked at it in a cumulative manner, in an aggregated manner. Now, aggregation is important, and it's important in science, it's important in logic. Think, for example, changes never occur dramatically. Water doesn't turn into ice immediately, right? You decrease the degrees, and at a certain point, you have a qualitative change, right? At a certain point, the quantity changes into, turns into quality, right? If someone has a lot of hairs and he starts losing one hair by another, eventually he will become bald, but it would be an incremental process. But the outcome is one of quality, of significance. It's not just a matter of quantity, it's a matter of quality. So this is why we think that amendments must be considered in an aggregated manner. The court must be somehow free to consider also the context and previous amendments, and then to examine how much the current amendment influences those protected principles when the rest of the context is taken into consideration. This is one proposal. The second proposal deals with constitutional replacement. Think of the Hungarian example. What is the difference? Okay, what is the difference if the Hungarian government now simply amended the constitution in a way that undermined democracy, or simply used the same majority it has, but brought a new constitution? Why? Simply because we call it a new constitution. Why is it immune from judicial review? We see no reason for that, right? So if the process, Tamar and I argue, of the new constitution making is quite similar to an amending one, it should still be open to judicial review. Of course, here we have many problems. On which grounds would you examine this new constitution? Vis-a-vis what? So that's a big problem. And here we, in the paper, we refer to many other scholars such as Ross Dixon and David Landau, and Vicky Jackson, and Carlos Bernal, who have various theories proposing limitations on original constituent power, how even constitution-making power may be limited. And I'm happy to elaborate on that in the discussion, because this is my next book project. So I'll be more than happy to elaborate on this point. The third solution, and with that I'll finish, is somehow a way to deal with judicial capture, with courts capture. And here with the following. What we suggest is that when the courts face constitutional amendments or legislation, ordinary legislation, that deals with the judiciary itself, that undermines judicial independence, the court must be especially activist. It must act towards a strong protection for judicial independence. Now, this goes against maybe conventional wisdom. On first look, you can say, wait, when the court deals with amendments that deal with the judiciary, it has to be very restrained, because then it looks like self-dealing. Oh, the judges are just acting to preserve their own powers. And this is why I originally thought courts should be very much restrained with amendments that deal with the judicial system, but not in the context of democratic erosion. Because if we really want to protect the entire democratic order, the first thing we need to do is to protect the judiciary, to protect its independence. And in order to protect its independence, the court must be especially militant, especially restrained, and not restrained, especially activist and militant when it comes to changes that undermine its own independence. So with these three directions in mind, we suggest the doctrine might be more useful in protecting democracy against democratic erosion. So I'll stop here because it's already 10:40, so we can have some time for a discussion and questions and answers. Thank you very much, my friends.
Thank you, Yaniv. We enjoyed your presentation. Also, your paper is it's very interesting because we have in Latin America many problems related with the abuse of constitutionalism, as you said in probably here with the Venezuela case, but also Bolivia, Ecuador, and as you say, also Honduras and Colombia. Also, we were in danger, and now maybe we're also in danger with the proposition of mega constitutional assembly because of the Supreme Court decision against President Uribe 2 weeks ago. We are very interested about your new proposition that is a new step in your research, and also I congratulate you because you think about the new problems that this erosion of democracy and also the abuse of the constitutionalism have to do with the limits related with the judiciary. So my first comment is related with that. Your paper say that, okay, let's see another, so let's see what to do with these kinds of problems. But I think that also you see more in the judiciary, no, that solve that problems related with this judiciary. But what can we do about democracy? If we can do another thing about democracy, for example, we see that every time Professor Roberto Gargarella, his proposition related with deliberative democracy, and also that not focus only in the judiciary, but also in what he called the machine room. No? So what do you think about that? What can we do about the democracy? We can our research as a professor. We have to do another kind of or think about another kind of democracy. Thinking about, for example, the example in Iceland or now in Chile that are doing a new constitution, also more inclusive or try. So what do you think about that? And also with the problem or court packing, no? What do you think if that happened? What can a constitutional state do? So they are my two questions. What can we do about democracy? And what it happens, court packing, what can we do about that? Entonces voy a traducir un poco. Pues me gustó mucho su escrito y creo que pues ya es un paso más que da Yaniv en sus estudios sobre reforma a la Constitución y lo que tiene que ver con el problema, digamos, o lo que él ha propuesto de la inconstitucionalidad de las reformas constitucionales y con estas propuestas, pero le pregunto que qué se puede hacer, porque le pregunto que veo que su paper se enfoca en el judicial y qué hacer con los jueces, pero qué hacer con la democracia, y propuestas como la democracia deliberativa, propuestas por Roberto Gargarella, si se puede hacer algo allí también de parte de la doña. Y lo otro es qué hacer cuando se presenta pues cuando se cooptan las cortes constitucionales o tribunales constitucionales o supremas cortes de justicia por parte de estos poderes, ¿qué se puede hacer? So, thank you, Yaniv.
Thank you so much. So I'll start actually with the latter question, the second question, because it's easier for me, the court packing. So what Tamar and I deal with in the paper is the preliminary stage before the court has already been packed or captured. So when the court has already been captured, for our analysis, that's already too late. So what we try to do is to give tools to jurisdictions in the more preliminary or earlier stage, right? So like in India or Bangladesh recently, when you had amendments trying to change the way judges are appointed, the judiciary blocked it. Now, when people read the judgments, they say, oh, come on. Let's take the Indian example. So in India, the judges, the Supreme Court, have the final word on judicial appointments to the Supreme Court. And the government wanted to change that to a committee that would be also composed of politicians, etc. The Indian Supreme Court in 2015 said, no, this would undermine judicial independence and we will not allow it. Now, when other people in the world read this judgment, they say, this is madness. Because in many countries in the world, the judicial process is controlled by politicians, or at least the politicians have a dominant role in it. So actually, what we're trying to do is to defend this approach in the context of democratic erosion, because this is the only way to protect judicial independence. If right from the start you say, no, we will not allow you to touch upon the judiciary. Now, court packing is so problematic, but it's also problematic because usually what people give you, they give you the American examples of court packing, right? So, if it happened in the US, why can't it happen in our, but still court packing, I think is quite problematic. It's another mechanism to control the court. So at least in the context of democratic erosion, we should be very cautious about this. I want to say two things about, I'll leave democracy for last because that's the most problematic one. I want to talk about democratic constitution making process. You've mentioned Ireland and Iceland. So I think that is very much correct. What we need to do, at least in the context of constitution making processes, we need to think of new mechanisms that would make these processes, on the one hand, very much deliberative, very much inclusive of the people, so that they would carry much more legitimacy, etc. They also need to be time-consuming, so it's not something that occurs quickly. And these processes must, high degree, or as much as possible, manifest people's will. Right? What we don't want a leader saying, or a government, or a dominant party saying, we represent the people and we now bring a new constitution, right? We don't have someone like Napoleon saying, Je suis le pouvoir constituant, I am the constituent power, I represent the people and I bring a new constitution. We don't want that. We need to figure out what kind of mechanisms we can have to make sure that the constitution making process is not being captured and would reflect the people's will as much as possible. Now, some mechanisms, as we've seen in examples in Ireland and Iceland, for example, is to have popular assemblies that are randomly selected, randomly elected. Think, for example, like a lottery, like the jury system in the US, right? So we elect arbitrarily, we elect 120 members of the public who would represent the people gender-wise, etc. But these are ordinary people who represent the people, who will form the main body of the Constituent Assembly. Politicians who will be there, want the president to bring his own people. This could be quite an interesting system, and this would make sure that this really reflects the people in a way. And then after a referendum. So I agree that we need to think of other mechanisms, and now we have these various examples from Ireland and Iceland that can be useful case studies. But I want to touch upon the first point you've mentioned, how can court protect democracy? And I think this is very much problematic because the big problem that we see now in democratic erosion is what we mean by democracy. What do we mean by democracy? In Hungary, Viktor Orban declared Hungary to be an illiberal democracy. He says, yes, we are still a democracy, but we're an illiberal one. In the speech, he said, yes, we are still a democracy, but we are a Christian democracy. And in Turkey, Erdogan claimed that Turkey is an example of an Islamic democracy. And Israel is a Jewish democracy. So what are we talking about when we talk about democracy? So in Israel, for example, we have very difficult debates on different notions of democracy, substantive notions of democracy versus simply procedural notions of democracy. So, for example, the previous government was a populist right-wing government, said that democracy is majority rule. We, the majority represents the people, and because the people are the sovereign and the people are omnipotent, they can do whatever they want. So we, the majority, can do whatever we want because we and only we represent the people. So the winner takes it all. For them, this is democracy. It's only about the elections. The winner now represents the people. Now, this notion of democracy, I think, is very much problematic. If two wolves and a sheep sit together and then have a vote what to have for dinner, I don't think this is a democratic decision-making process. Right? It may be a majoritarian one, but not a democratic one. Democracy must include some substance. It must include a minimal protection of fundamental rights, of separation of powers, of the rule of law, without which there's no such thing as democracy. So before we go to discuss what courts can do in order to protect democracy, we need to understand what we're talking about when we talk about democracy. So I think that we must agree that there are certain minimal conditions without which the legal system is no longer democratic. You can call it illiberal democracy or other names, but it's simply not a democracy if it doesn't have certain minimal protection of rights or fundamental principles. Now, once we agree on this definition, I think that the court can have an important role in protecting democracy in various ways. One way, in protecting separation of powers. For example, when the government or when the executive undermines the legislator, undermines the parliament, for example, rushing legislation through the legislator, or not having and not bringing a budget for approval. These kind of things, the court can play an important role in protecting separation of powers, to protect the legislator basically from the executive. A second role is protecting fundamental rights. Of course, the court can have an important role in protecting minority rights and fundamental rights more generally. And the third role is more generally protecting the democratic order and its basic principles, primarily through judicial review of constitutional amendments and this doctrine of unconstitutional amendments. So I think, yes, the court can have an important role, and the role in protecting democracy comes in three ways. The first way is in putting a stop sign, if you like, before the politicians. So take the case of Uribe, right? The court says, no, we will not allow this change. And then the president steps down and we have elections. So this was a useful stop sign. Or for example, in Uganda, in 2018, the Ugandan parliament amended the constitution in a way that extended the term of parliament, I think in 2 more years. The Constitutional Court blocked that amendment. It said that this is an abuse of constituent power, of the amending power, and invalidate that amendment. And then the legislature said, okay. So the court managed to put a stop sign before various changes. The court can also function as some kind of a chilling effect or a warning sign, if you like. So think, for example, of the legislator, the parliament that now sits and think of amendments to the Constitution. And during the debates, someone says, wait, the change that you're proposing undermines the basic principles of the constitutional order, and the court might invalidate it. Then the legislators might think twice and change the drafting in a way that makes the amendment more in accordance with the basic principles. And I have examples for that, for example, from Israel and Italy and other places. So even without judicial review, just the fear or the idea that a court might interfere can be useful in protecting democracy. And the third way by which the court can be useful in protecting democracy is not on its own, but by providing weapons or tools to third parties, to politicians, to the opposition, to civil society, to the people, right? So if now the court on its own cannot save democracy, that's clear. But if the court says this change that the government is now bringing is unconstitutional, this provides other people in the jurisdiction, in the country, tools to fight this change and to object to this change. So I think these are three mechanisms by which the court can act quite usefully in protecting democracy once we understood what we mean by democracy.
Bueno, ella nos dice un poco, si pueden apagar el retorno, los micrófonos. Bueno, nos dice Yaniv un poco sobre los problemas del cooptar las cortes. Esto puede ser, digamos, un dilema que habría que resolver también. Sobre la otra pregunta, él nos dijo más o menos lo siguiente, voy a traducir así a grandes rasgos, que hay que tener 3 elementos para buscar que fundamentalmente se diga que es democracia, ¿no? Es un concepto que hay que empezar a buscar. No es la democracia de mayorías, del mayor número, sino otro tipo de democracias, sobre todo para el rol que cumplen los jueces cuando van a decidir este tipo de... Si pueden apagar los micrófonos, Lila, porfa. Sí, ¿qué hacer, no? Vamos con las preguntas. Si me pueden ayudar con los micrófonos, voy a deshabilitarlos todos y solo voy a abrirlos a los que alcen la mano. Entonces vamos con Juan Fernando Londoño. Okay. Nos va a ayudar aquí, nos va a ayudar Camila, afortunadamente nos va a ayudar acá con la traducción de las preguntas que haga Juan Fernando. Pero bueno, Juan Fernando la va a hacer en inglés, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Bueno, los que no quieran hacerla en español, Camila nos ayuda y con algo de la traducción. Gracias, Cami.
Okay. Can you hear me, Yaniv? Okay.
Yes.
Well, thanks for your presentation and also for your paper. I enjoyed very much reading it. I'm going to make the role of the advocate's devil here. I'm going to try to state 3 brief critiques to your paper. The first and most important is that we cannot state an anti-democratic theory to protect democracy. And at the end of your theory is an anti-democratic role of the court. So basically, paraphrasing Mark Tushnet, you are taking democracy away from the people and putting democracy in the hands of the Constitutional Court. And I found that profoundly problematic. And especially when you mention the authority to review constitutional assemblies, constitutional process, not just constitutional amendments. In the case of constitutional amendments, I think you're right, and I strongly believe there is a room for constitutional courts to protect democracy before it's too late. I totally agree with that. But in the case of reviewing constitutional assemblies, I really have profound problems with that. Especially, and I think if people make mistakes, I think that's part of the freedom of people, you know. You cannot say that, well, it's that democracy is about all the time taking the right decisions, because sometimes it doesn't work that way. So my first point is that. The second point is related to the authority of the courts to review those amendments, because in some cases, there is also room for abuse of the Constitutional Court to review. In the case of Colombia, for example, we have read recently a paper from Gonzalo, and he mentioned that in the lapse of 10 years or less, the Constitutional Court of Colombia used this doctrine to strike down 8 or 9 constitutional reforms. Two of them, to mention a couple of examples, are related to civil service. And I don't believe that civil service, for example, is part of the core of the Constitution. So I believe that in this case, they are using a doctrine to state that basically they don't like that kind of reform. And even if they are right, I don't believe that they can use that power in that way. Even if you agree with the reasoning of the court, I don't believe that is a good use of that power, that you have to reserve that kind of power for something that is really important. And using the word that Landau and using in a paper, you have to protect the core of democracy. And that's when you have this power to use it wisely. And the third critic is that if they use this kind of power to review, in some cases, they could become very protective of the status quo. And you have to be aware of the case in the United States, what the Supreme Court did with the New Deal, for example. Mm-hmm. They struck down all the reforms of President Roosevelt, and at the end they changed their mind. But if you put this kind of tool without any kind of counterbalancing or accountability, that could be a power that most of the court could use to protect the status quo. And I think that is something that is also very risky. Those are my 3 points. Thank you for your presentation, and I really enjoy. And I think that this is a debate that is open, and we're going to start to discuss this for so many years now on. Thank you very much.
Juan, could you please translate your question in Spanish very briefly?
Okay, no. Okay, I'm going to translate it. Sí, mencioné que había 3 problemas básicamente que estoy tratando de hacer de abogado del diablo. El primero es relacionado, digamos que esta puede ser una doctrina antidemocrática para proteger la democracia, y es creer que las cortes, digamos, pueden saber más de democracia que el pueblo, y que eso es particularmente problemático en el caso de la revisión de los procesos de asambleas constitucionales, ya no de reformas constitucionales, sino de creación de nuevas constituciones. El segundo problema es un poco el abuso que se haga de esta doctrina cuando las cortes empiecen a revisar reformas y simplemente en cosas que no les gustan, pero que no son parte de los elementos básicos de la democracia, empiecen a decir que hay un reemplazo democrático. Y ahí cito el trabajo de Gonzalo, que menciona, digamos, los 8 reformas donde la Corte ha tumbado las reformas constitucionales usando esta doctrina, en 2 casos en temas de servicio civil y carrera administrativa, por ejemplo, que difícilmente uno puede decir que eso es parte del núcleo fundamental de la Constitución. Y termino señalando el problema que tiene esta doctrina en el sentido de que puede volver a las cortes ultraconservadoras y protectoras del status quo, e impedir que se hagan cambios y transformaciones. Y aquí tenemos el antecedente del papel que cumplió la Corte Suprema de los Estados Unidos durante el periodo del New Deal de Roosevelt, que básicamente tumbó todas las reformas hasta que al final, digamos, cedió y cambió su propia doctrina. Gracias.
Gracias.
So thank you, Juan. Thank you very much for these 3 points. I think these are excellent points. And I have to say that although you've been the devil's advocate, I think we're much more in agreement than disagreement. And then I'll try to explain. And I'll start actually from the last point. So protecting the status quo, I think you're correct. I mean, the doctrine of unconstitutional amendment was always considered a conservative doctrine, because the idea of blocking reforms is to maintain the status quo. But here I think actually judicial review of amendments has the capacity to make some advancements. Because think, for example, of, let's say, the French Constitution that protects the Republican form of government. What Republican form of government means is very much open for interpretation and reinterpretation and change. Now, this allows the court, if we simply had this unamendable provision without judicial review, this might have caused some stagnation. It would freeze the constitutional order. But because the court has the capacity to interpret this principle and reinterpret it and change it, this allows the court, on the one hand, to advance and to allow some progress, but at the same time to protect the core of those principles that are protected. So it's not only negative. I mean, I agree with you that this is danger, that we'll have a status quo, but I think also here the court can play some positive role. The second point was about abuse of the doctrine, and I completely agree with you. There was a recent paper by Ross Dixon and David Landau about abusive judicial review, how courts undermine democracy. But I want to talk about a different type of abuse where the court abuses this doctrine simply to enhance its own powers, to protect its own powers. Now, this is, of course, a problem. And I think the balance would be quite problematic. I think that in an ordinary state of affairs, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would say that the court, when it deals with an amendment that deals with its own powers or structure, should not touch it, should be very much restrained. But in the context of democratic erosion, I think it is legitimate for the court to be quite more activist. I agree in general that what we need to protect is the core of the principles that are the pillars of democracy. I agree. I completely agree about that. Now, about the anti-democratic court and about constitution-making process, here I also think we are in agreement more than you think. Because what Tamar and I suggest is that we cannot treat constitution-making process as a binary thing. It must be open for review. No, we say that process matters, and we need to see what the process is. The more the process resembles a new original constitution-making process, the less the court should intervene. So if you have elections to a new Constituent Assembly that sits and debates it, and it is inclusive and deliberative, and then they bring it to the people in a referendum, the court should not intervene. But if the process resembles that of a constitutional amendment, like in Hungary, they simply use the 2/3 in parliament to bring a new constitution, then this, we think, should still be open for judicial review. Because we don't see any reason why to make the distinction between the two, simply because the title is different. So I think we're more in agreement. There's a spectrum, if you like, of constitutional change. And the more it looks like an invocation of really original constituent power with the people, then the less limitations should be and the less the court should intervene. I completely agree with this. About the anti-democratic, that's the first point, that the court, yes, that's the main critique against the doctrine, that it's undemocratic. But I don't really accept this criticism for the following reason. If you consider the doctrine of unconstitutional amendments in the proper manner, then it is actually a mechanism that protects the people against the government, against their agents. When it is correctly exercised by the court, and sometimes you are right, the court abuses it, but when it is correctly exercised by the court, what the doctrine says is the following thing. It tells the government, the agents, excuse me, you are merely constituted organs with limited authority. There are certain things that are so important to the constitutional order, to the identity of the constitutional order, that only the people can decide to change them. It's not for you to decide. You need to go back to the people to decide. This is the real meaning behind the Unconstitutional Amendment doctrine. So it is not that it's undemocratic in the sense that it says you save the people from themselves, etc. What the doctrine says, it makes a distinction between the people and the government. And it tells the government, it protects this vertical separation of powers. And it tells the government, for this change, we block you because you need to go to a different route, to a different process that is more democratic. You need to go to the real people to make sure that they really want this change. So if you consider, if the doctrine is exercised in this manner, then it is actually democratic enhancing rather than undermining democracy.
Bueno, Cami, si nos puedes ayudar.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos y a todas. Pues vamos a resumir un poco las respuestas del profesor Roznai respecto a las preguntas del profesor Juan Fernando. Entonces, pues, primero que todo, él hizo referencia a la última pregunta que tiene que ver con la protección del status quo a través de esta lectura que se hace de la teoría de la reforma de la Constitución. Entonces, pues digamos, la respuesta del profesor Roznai iba enfocada un poco a que así se considere un poco conservadora esta posición. En realidad, lo que se hace es decir, como la Corte tiene un papel especial, incluso si se dice que es un punto de vista conservador, y es dar como luces a los poderes públicos, ¿no? De dar una serie de advertencias para decir que está bien, que está mal, digamos, a la luz de esos principios básicos de la democracia, y le permite dos cosas a las Cortes a través de la interpretación. Una, hacer avances en esos mínimos o en esos núcleos básicos de la Constitución, y dos, le permite también, digamos, proteger la Constitución misma, ¿no? Entonces, un ejercicio de interpretación y de protección como de ese núcleo principal. Ahora bien, el profesor Roznai continuó con la respuesta de la segunda pregunta e hizo referencia que tenía que ver, digamos, con las autoridades públicas, digamos, como este poder de reforma, y que en la pregunta el profesor Juan Fernando da ejemplos, por ejemplo, de Colombia y la protección, digamos, a estos núcleos básicos de la democracia. Y él hace referencia a un artículo de Rosalind Dixon y David Landau, donde dice, bueno, cómo las Cortes, digamos, como que minan estos principios básicos de la democracia. Y la respuesta a este punto dice como, claro, es que acá no estamos hablando de cualquier contexto, estamos hablando de un contexto de erosión de la democracia. Y en estos contextos de erosión de la democracia, lo que sea, pues es deseable que tengamos cortes mucho más activas, ¿no? Que intervengan mucho más en estos, pues porque lo que está en juego son pues el núcleo mismo de la democracia. Por último, se hizo referencia a la primera pregunta, que tiene que ver con todo este poder, digamos, antidemocrático de las Cortes, que es una gran crítica a esta teoría de las reformas de la Constitución. Y acá pues la respuesta es como, claro, digamos, es una crítica muy recurrente, pero yo no la acepto por al menos dos cosas. La primera es porque en teoría, digamos, una corte, entre más, digamos, original sea la intervención que se hace respecto de ese núcleo mínimo que tuvo en cuenta el constituyente primario, pues se desearía que la Corte pues, interviniera menos, ¿no? Es como una cuestión de proporciones. Y la segunda crítica, pues el profesor Roznai dice, claro, yo la tengo en cuenta, pero no la acepto, porque tengamos en cuenta que las Cortes actúan como un mecanismo de protección, y si se hace una lectura adecuada, digamos, de la teoría de la reforma de la Constitución o los límites a la reforma de la Constitución, pues las decisiones de la Corte terminan siendo una protección de la gente contra el gobierno de turno. Y en esa medida, las decisiones de la Corte son un límite para el gobierno que le dice, por favor, vuelva hacia el pueblo y mire qué es lo que ellos quieren y permita tomar esas decisiones conforme a lo que el pueblo quiere. Entonces, a través de estos tres puntos, pues el profesor Roznai ya responde las preguntas del profesor Juan Fernando.
Muchas gracias. Bueno, vamos con Amaury también. Gracias, Cami. Excelente traducción. Bueno, Amaury Reyes y después viene Marcos, David. Mireya iba a preguntar, pero desistió. Bueno, vamos con Amaury. Si la puedes hacer en inglés, la haces y la traduces un poco.
David estaba antes que yo, Gonzalo.
Bueno, bien. Entonces va con Amaury, David, Marcos.
Okay, Professor Yaniv, thank you very much for your presentation. Two things. I really love reading your article and your book. And interesting thing is that I mostly disagree with most of your arguments, but I think it's really good to read from you and all your perspective. It's actually very refreshing. I have two questions, and maybe both of them are very related to the one posed by Professor Juan Fernando. The first one is why, if we approach to this notion of unconstitutional amendment, a notion which I have some problems dealing with, or to accept that that's absolute, that can be, why we do not separate the democratic foundation of the doctrine and try to appeal to a more Republican standpoint. And because at the end, a court, a constitutional court, is not a democratic institution, unless, of course, there is something in the Constitution that allowed us to vote for the members of the court. But let's assume, like in most of the cases, it's not a democratic constitution, and the democratic legitimacy is way different than other authorities in one state. That's from one point. And the second point is, okay, I understand the view, and I know that I am in a minority here. I understand the view and the distinction between the primary and the secondary constituent power. I do believe that that is just an analytical concept to describe something that have some epistemic problems with. But if we appeal through a court that has some democratic legitimacy problems to defend democracy, are we not contributing to make the political culture of the society less and less strong to deal with the possible erosion of the democratic and republican institutions? Why should we have a court to do the dirty work that we as the people, regardless the notion that we might have of the people, why we allow the courts to do the dirty job that we are supposed to do in a democracy in which there is a strong political culture? So that is the 2 points. Thank you very much for your presentation, and again, keep working on your topics. And you have someone that actually dissents with you, but again, so good that you're writing about these topics and from your perspective. It's actually very refreshing. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Maury, could you please briefly translate your questions?
Okay. Gonzalo, bueno, todas le preguntaba al profesor Yaniv lo primero, ¿por qué? Bueno, le decía que yo básicamente no estoy de acuerdo con todo lo que el profesor usualmente escribe, pero me encanta leerlo. Creo que es extraordinario su investigación. Pero le preguntaba primero por qué no cambiamos el fundamento de la doctrina de las enmiendas inconstitucionales o de las reformas inconstitucionales desde el punto de vista yendo de lo democrático y mejor de lo republicano, atendiendo de que una corte constitucional es usualmente un órgano antidemocrático o contramayoritario. Y la segunda pregunta era por qué, o más bien, si apelar a esta doctrina no nos convierte en personas políticamente apáticas o vagas, lazy, ¿no? Y que básicamente le entregamos a las cortes realizar el trabajo sucio del pueblo, quien es que debe fortalecer su propia cultura política y reclamar esos ataques o desacuerdos democráticos y no así una corte. Creo que es en esencia, Gonzalo, ¿no?
Sí, gracias.
Perfecto, muchas gracias.
Gonzalo, and I would need a brief translation for Maria's remarks.
From who? Maria's?
Yes.
Well, O sea, de las preguntas de Amaury.
No, it's a translation of what you said. Maria is just translated to. It's not any comment.
Okay. So Amaury, thank you very much. These are wonderful points. Really two good points. I'm glad you're dissenting with me. I mean, otherwise it would have been too boring. But let me. Okay, I think I have some reasonable, fair responses to that. I'll start with the first one, which I think is easier. Actually, according to my theory, it doesn't have to be the court. I see the problems with the court. I see the legitimacy problem that you raise, and it could be any other institution, as long as it is separated from the politicians. I don't want the amending authority itself to be also the guardian of its limits. So, in theory, you could have a commission of citizens elected as juries, and they will decide whether the amendments trespass their boundaries or not. I'll be fine with that. And I think such a mechanism could have a greater democratic legitimacy, and the people would change, like they would be elected only when you have a challenge to a constitutional amendment. I'll be happy with that. But I'm not writing in an ideal, unrealistic world. And basically, I'm trying to design the things we have to do, the things that are really taking place. And naturally, what we have institutions, judicial institutions, that this seems to be their natural role, just as they adjudicate, I don't know, primary legislation vis-a-vis the Constitution and secondary legislation vis-a-vis ordinary legislation, then it seems like a natural role also to review amendments vis-a-vis protected unamendable principles. I see the problems with it, but it seems to be like a natural role. And the fact that they are acting in a counter-majoritarian manner seems to be inherent to their job, because if they were majoritarian institutions, we didn't need them. We don't need the court to approve whatever the majority wants. But at least here, when they function as somehow protecting the people, they can tell the momentarian majority, just hold. Let's make sure that this change does not reflect simply the will or the caprice of the current majority in parliament. We want to make sure that this really reflects the will of the people. And if this is what it aims to do, then it is not acting in a counter-majoritarian manner. It is actually majoritarian, because it wants to make sure that really the majority of the people want this change. To the second point, but again, it doesn't have to be the court. To the second point, I have to disagree. I mean, this is quite a common criticism against my paper. Well, the fact that everything goes eventually to the court, even the fundamental principles and fundamental values, this makes the court the final arbitrators of society's values, and it erodes public discussion and democratic involvement, because the people don't have any role eventually, and it's just the judges. I disagree, because I think that often when you have litigation about these constitutional changes, what you do, you bring these questions to the center of the public arena and to the public discussion. I'll give you an example from Israel. So 2 years ago, our legislator enacted a new constitutional law, basic law, Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. Now, this basic law was challenged before our Supreme Court. Now, if it hadn't been challenged, this was the end of the story. There were some debates in parliament, some op-eds in newspapers, there was 1 or 2 protests, and then that's it. But since we had, I think, 15 or 16 challenges before the High Court of Justice against this basic law, the public debate on the basic law is simply unbelievable. There isn't a day without people talking about it. And and evaluating what the court would do, and is it okay for the court to intervene? But how can the court decide? What are the basic principles of our society? Is the basic law legitimate or illegitimate? So this whole litigation that allegedly isolated things from the public debate actually does just the opposite. It brings things to the fore of the debate. So I agree with the risks that you mentioned, but I also think that litigation could have positive effects also in bringing things to discussion. And in the Israeli example, I think we have many examples for that. For example, when the court has to decide who is a Jew or whether a Jewish Orthodox can serve the military or are exempt from the military. So the fact that the court deals with it, you can see how much the public is now involved surrounding this litigation and the court judgments, before the judgments and after the judgments. So I think also in that respect, the court has a positive effect. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor.
So now Maria Camila is going to translate a little bit what you say. Thank you.
Thank you, Gonzalo. I'll tell you why I was surprised before about Maria, because I thought I spoke not so long, and then Maria was speaking for so long. Maybe it's the translation between English and Spanish.
It is.
So I haven't realized I've been speaking that much.
Don't worry about it.
Well, bueno, vamos a tratar de hacer como los puntos un poco más concretos. El español a veces se presta para ampliar un poco, pero ok. Bueno, respecto de la primera pregunta, pues el profesor Roznai dijo, bueno, vamos a empezar por aquí, que es un poco el tema más sencillo de abordar. Y sobre esto, pues la respuesta es, claro, no tiene que ser precisamente la Corte o un tribunal constitucional el que realice esta tarea, ¿no? De revisar estas reformas constitucionales. Puede ser cualquier otro órgano, institución o mecanismo en la medida en que esté políticamente separada, por ejemplo, una comisión ciudadana. Entonces, la cuestión es que tenga, pues, como que tenga una mayor legitimidad democrática, y el punto es que, claro, aquí no se está hablando como de un mundo ideal, sino de lo que podemos hacer con los casos concretos que tenemos, y en esa medida el profesor Roznai dice, claro, lo que yo escribo tiene que ver con lo que conozco del mundo real, y en esa medida pues se habla también un poco de la crítica contramayoritaria para decir que pues si las cortes o tribunales constitucionales fueran órganos mayoritarios, pues simplemente no los necesitaríamos. Y entonces aquí la pregunta es, claro, ellos están para decirle a los otros órganos del poder público qué es lo que quieren las mayorías, qué es lo que quiere o cuál es la voluntad de los ciudadanos. Entonces es como una señal que nos permite decir, es en realidad el deseo del pueblo para tomar unas decisiones en nuestra sociedad. Y aquí doy paso a la segunda respuesta, que tiene que ver con el rol del ciudadano activo en política y como la relación que tiene el Tribunal Constitucional. El profesor Roznai dice, claro, yo no estoy de acuerdo, y no estoy de acuerdo porque aquí el litigio tiene un papel esencial para poner sobre la mesa debates importantes para cómo nos concebimos nosotros como sociedad, y pone un ejemplo particular sobre Israel y, digamos, la revisión como de la ley fundamental, que puso sobre la mesa como, bueno, cuáles son nuestros principios básicos como sociedad, quién es un judío, cómo, digamos, cómo afecta esto nuestra concepción de Estado judío, y pues básicamente es como el poder de, a través del litigio, poner los puntos clave para discutir y para configurar una sociedad, y se ponen frente de una Corte Constitucional que protege este núcleo de la Constitución.
Ahorita viene el profesor, vamos a ir terminando con las dos últimas preguntas. So there are only two questions left. First of all is David Cruz, and then is Marcos Criado. David, please. David.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here, Professor Yaniv. First, I'm sorry for my English. I try to be accurate, but I'm not inexperienced in this language. But I would like to make one comment about your work. I see some relationship between the use of the constitutional amendments and the emergence of new constitutions that could be considered also as a democratic payback. So my question is this dangerous to me to use that doctrine if you say to the political actors that they cannot amend the constitution in some ways, and because they will find the way to create a political environment to emerge a new constitution. And that new constitution can be more dangerous even than incremental democratic erosion. If you see the same danger that I saw, and also how to fight against that dangers. And I believe that is present, for example, here in Colombia, and I would like to know your insights about it.
Gracias, David. ¿La puedes traducir brevemente al español? Briefly to Spanish.
Yo veo una relación entre la teoría de la doctrina de las enmiendas inconstitucionales y el hecho de que surjan nuevas constituciones, y es la siguiente. Cuando una corte decide qué se puede reformar y qué no se puede reformar, también le está diciendo a los actores políticos en qué momentos pueden utilizar teorías como el poder constituyente para cambiar una constitución de forma total. Y puede que esos cambios totales sean incluso más peligrosos para la democracia que un escenario de erosión democrática incremental como la propone el profesor Roznai. Entonces mi pregunta es si él ve también ese peligro y, digamos, cómo se podría afrontar ese peligro en este escenario.
Okay, Yaniv, you have 5 minutes.
I'll be very brief. Thank you, David. It's a great question. So I don't think I share the same fear as you for the following reason. I mean, I completely agree with you that telling politicians they can't amend the Constitution, then they will simply say, okay, I will find ways to replace the Constitution with a new Constitution. I agree with that. But what I think that opting to a new constitution for the politicians is more risky and more dangerous than opting for a constitutional amendment for various reasons. When you start a new constitution making process, this raises the costs for the politicians. I mean, you know how you start, how you end it, a new constitution making process. So for them to opt to a new constitution making process would be quite risky. Also, when they amend the constitution, they can simply amend the feature that they want, the term limits, the religion, whatever they want. If they open it in a new constitution making process, then they open everything. Everything is. Now, I agree it might eventually be more, the constitution might be more negative or more bad than the original one, but you never know because everything is now open. And when everything is open, then it's more risky also for the politicians, unless they have a complete capture of the Constituent Assembly, which they can control. But this is even quite difficult for politicians. So I don't think I share the same fear as you. What I fear is that through amendments, what governments sometimes do, when you simply say, oh, I'm just amending the Constitution, but what you basically do, you have such amendments, what Richard Albert calls dismemberments, right? You have amendments that are so fundamentally violative of the Constitution that they're practically like a new Constitution. But when they're disguised as amendments, then not all the people are aware to how dramatic the change is, and people can't really resist it. And it goes through the political process anyway. When you tell the people, oh, now we're starting a new constitution making process, people are alert. They know that something big is happening. They want to see what's going on. They maybe be involved. When it's simply an amendment, you can somehow make it more, I don't know, like underground, you know, without people really realizing how revolutionary the change that you made. So so frankly, I think I fear amendments, perhaps even more than new constitution making.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cami, por favor.
Bueno. Digamos, acá hay un punto, digamos, como de acuerdo y de desacuerdo, de acuerdo al profesor Roznai. Digamos que él comparte un poco la inicial, pero él no está de acuerdo con que digamos, esto sea un real peligro en la medida en que hacer una constituyente en realidad es mucho más peligroso porque se abre una puerta a cambiar todo, ¿no? Entonces él dice, aquí no sabemos qué va a pasar, es mucho más riesgoso, incluso para los mismos políticos, porque la puerta al cambio está abierta y para todo. Entonces, acá, digamos, él hace referencia a un concepto de Richard Albert, dismemberment, y que acá en realidad lo más, digamos, una enmienda constitucional, claro que es riesgosa, pero tiene otro tipo de riesgos, ¿no? Porque el riesgo real acá es que no tiene como esa vigilancia pública, que sí tendría un proceso constituyente completo, ¿no? Acá, digamos, los cambios que se hacen no tienen como esa vigilancia ciudadana dura, que sí tendría una constituyente en la medida en que todos van a estar vigilando y van a estar preguntando qué hay detrás. Entonces,
muchas gracias. Nuevo, ya es la última pregunta, que es de Marcos Criado. Sí,
claro.
y sí, Marcos.
Thank you very much, Yaniv, for your presentation and for your work. They're always intellectually provoking, and I like very much, I enjoy very much reading them. I want to make three questions. The first one is, why democratic erosion and no liberal erosion? Because it's not true that what we're saying is not an erosion of the decision-making process, but an erosion of the liberal limits to democratic decision-making process. Moral. The second one is, there is something that allows us to analyze in a general way such different experience as Belarusia, Hungary, Poland, the Peruvian experience under Fujimori, Venezuela, and if so, empowering the court, it's gonna be a solution for all this kind of a liberal experience and liberal events. And if so, if we are looking for a way to empower constitutional courts, we then need a power conflict theory, not only a way to see how unconstitutional amendments theories works for empowering the courts, but a more open kind of view, or a wider kind of view, like a conflict power theory. And the third one, and the third question is that you don't think that some of these modifications of the unconstitutional amendments doctrine could be used to protect the conservative role of judges in some constitutional system, as the Spanish one, for example. Judges in Spain are majoritarian conservative, and they have made an interpretation of the Constitution very conservative. And systematically, they don't use some kind of articles and principles and interpretations of the Constitution that could be more progressive than the normal ones. If we protect courts from renew, we are not protecting this all interpretation of the Constitution, this conservative interpretation of the Constitution. We are not preserving the courts to a kind of switch in time, as Juan Fernando Londoño said before. These are my two questions.
Marcos, ¿puedes traducir brevemente?
Sí, la primera pregunta que hice a Yaniv es sobre si, por qué una erosión democrática, habla él, y por qué no una erosión liberal. En el sentido de que las experiencias que estamos erosionan los límites liberales al proceso de decisión democrática más que el proceso de decisión democrática en sí mismo. La segunda pregunta era sobre si él entendía que había algo que nos permitía tratar conjuntamente experiencias muy diversas entre sí, como puede ser desde la Bielorrusia de hoy hasta la experiencia de Perú con Fujimori. ¿no? Y si verdaderamente todas estas experiencias iliberales pueden ser solucionadas a través de un empoderamiento de las Cortes Constitucionales. Y si cree que todo esto puede ser solucionado a través de un empoderamiento de la Corte Constitucional, si no cree que no vale solo con modificaciones a la doctrina de las enmiendas inconstitucionales, sino que hace falta una nueva teoría de los conflictos entre poderes constitucionales. Y la tercera pregunta era si él no cree que algunos de los de las enmiendas inconstitucionales puede servir para perpetuar en el poder a una clase judicial conservadora que sistemáticamente evita la aplicación de ciertos artículos o de ciertas interpretaciones de la Constitución más progresistas que la media de la aplicación de la Constitución.
Okay, thank you. Yaniv, you have only 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Gonzalo, and thank you very much for these wonderful remarks, really good questions. So I'll start by the order. Why do I say democratic erosion rather than liberal erosion? So I think there are two answers to that. The first one is that, of course, democracy can be more liberal or less liberal, right? Let's say there's a spectrum of liberalism. But I think even a minimal understanding of democracy must be to some extent liberal in various senses that we must have some protection of fundamental rights, for example. So even if we consider just elections, just procedural democracy, okay, I'm not talking on some, I don't know, Barockian substantive democracy. No, just the notion of procedural democracy, just elections. Even elections, in order for elections to be genuine, we must have some protection of free speech, of freedom of association, of rule of law, to make sure that the elections are not fraud, etc. We must have some separation of powers to make sure that the courts have some oversight over the process. So even simply electoral democracy is, to my understanding, liberal to some extent. Now, it could be more liberal the more we put more on fundamental rights, etc. This is one point. But the second and most important point is this one. The authoritarian leaders in various countries will say, oh, no, we're in favor of illiberal democracy, formal democracy, etc. This is nonsense. They don't even care about procedural democracy, because ultimately their goal is power, to entrench its government, sure that replacement and rotation of the government would be as difficult as possible. And in order to do that, they make sure that other viewpoints that are not the government's viewpoints are illegitimate, and they make sure to change the election laws. Look at Hungary, look at Poland, look at Israel. What you see how the populist leader, in addition to all the other stuff, undermining checks and balances, etc., what they do, they change the election laws. So for example, in Hungary, they give the right of election to all nationals, which they know that would be in favor of the government, etc. So eventually, they don't even care about liberal or illiberal democracy. They simply don't care about democracy. They don't want to be replaced through democratic processes. And that's why I think democratic erosion is more spot on. About the more general public theory, I think you're right about that. And I think perhaps what we need is a general theory of what exactly is the people, which is obviously a difficult question people have been discussing in the last 300 years, but we need an understanding of what the people is, because what we see in this debate underlying the paper is this battle between two conflicting notions of the people. The populist leader says, I and only I represent the real people. And the court says, no. By protecting the basic principles of the Constitution, basically we protect the real people, the supra-generational people, if you like, or the supra-temporal people. So I agree that we need a more general public theory, but I think this theory has to be rooted in understanding what the people is and how the people can truly manifest its will. Once we'll be able to tackle this, maybe we'll never be able, I think this would be a good solution to the debate. And the third problem about the conservative judges, I'm not sure I understood the question, but I'll try to answer. I think, so maybe two things. If we take conservative judges like in Spain, I think there are various options. The first option, they simply will not exercise the doctrine. When you have conservative judges in various places, what they do, they take quite a formalistic approach and they don't have authority to review amendments. Like in France, for example, even if you have an unamendable provision, and we'll leave it to the political authorities. Now, this may change if you have, let's say, progressive politicians who would now want to change the constitution in a progressive way. Then you will see conservative judges being activists in order to preserve the status quo, as we discussed earlier. So I think perhaps then you'll be able to see how they actually use the doctrine for their own, I don't know, to preserve the values that they think are important. I think that's it. Yeah, 3 points. Thank you, Mark.
Bueno, brevemente, María Camila, muchas gracias.
Well, thank you, Professor. Bueno, respecto de la primera pregunta, acá tenemos como 2 puntos para hacer. El primero tiene que ver con qué consideramos nosotros liberal. Las democracias, de acuerdo al profesor Roznai, pueden ser más o menos liberales. El punto es que incluso en las menos liberales hay unos mínimos, como el respeto a unos procedimientos, particularmente a los procedimientos electorales, una democracia representativa, y que incluso para tener esas garantías democráticas debemos tener un respeto mínimo por derecho a la libertad de expresión, libertad de asociación, Estado de Derecho, digamos, la separación de poderes, y eso sigue siendo liberal en alguna medida. Ahora, ¿qué es lo que no quieren los líderes autoritarios? Que es como la segunda parte de este primer punto. Ellos no quieren de ninguna manera que se les reemplace, ¿no? Y en esa medida hasta esas mínimas garantías electorales se desaparecen de este contexto porque ellos modifican como el escenario democrático a tal punto en que cambian o vuelven aún más y más restringido el poder cambiar las formas en que se alterna el poder. En esa medida, ejemplos, por ejemplo, Hungría, Israel o Polonia, donde tenemos este tipo de líderes autoritarios y por eso él considera que no se debe hablar como tal de erosión liberal, sino de erosión democrática, porque lo que está en juego es pues, como la esencia misma de la democracia. Ahora, en la segunda respuesta, que tiene que ver con, bueno, ¿qué hacemos con empoderar a las cortes y demás? Él dice, bueno, lo primero que nos tenemos que preguntar aquí es pensarnos nuevamente una teoría de qué es el pueblo, ¿no? Entonces, como que acá hay 2 visiones antagónicas. Una, que es el pueblo de acuerdo a los líderes autoritarios que creen que el pueblo son como las personas reales, ¿no? Lo que está afuera, como ese deseo mayoritario. Pero lo que defienden las cortes constitucionales, que son como la teoría. Y en tercer lugar, lo dice como, bueno, acá, pues digamos, no sabe un poco bien cómo contestar la pregunta, pero dice, bueno, yo propongo 2 cosas. Aquí, en respecto, digamos, de estos jueces conservadores, la primera posibilidad es que simplemente ellos no quieran como usar la teoría, ¿sí? Pues en su, digamos, haciendo uso como de esas pequeñas libertades. Y en segundo lugar, pues una vía como de cambio para que si la utilizaran sería como no cambiarlo a los jueces ni pensar en las cortes, sino más bien como que ellos van a cambiar en la medida en que cambien políticos a unos políticos mucho más progresistas. Entonces, pues estos son como los 3 puntos para responder a las preguntas del profesor Marcos.
Muchísimas gracias a María Camila por esta traducción que nos hizo el favor aquí de aclararnos. Thank you very much, Professor Roznai, also, and all the people who participate in this seminar. We learned a lot about your paper, and we are going to discuss most about that, probably to do an answer to your paper. And thank you, Yaniv. Wonderful to talk with you and to exchange some ideas.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you everyone for participating and for your great questions. And especially thank you, Maria, for your translation. I'm sure it wasn't an easy job, and I appreciate it a lot. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
I enjoyed it.
Very, very welcome. Thank you all.
Okay, so we are going to show a video because we are in October, we have a seminar from the Constitutional Department of Universidad Seminario. So we invite you all to participate in this conference. It's free and also online. So here is the poster. We are going to, vamos a hacer una, so I changed to Spanish. Vamos a hacer una jornada de Derecho Constitucional en octubre, del 7 al 9. Y queríamos terminar esto pues promocionando un poco la actividad. Hoy el 18 de agosto se vence el plazo para que envíen las 3 formas de participación, que son comunicaciones individuales o por paneles, café con el autor, que pueden invitar a un autor como Yaniv para que hablemos sobre estos 4 temas, por ejemplo, y lo que hemos llamado intercambio de saberes, que es hablar con personas de la sociedad civil, no precisamente académicos, jueces, etcétera, que intercambiemos ideas con los académicos. En esas 3 modalidades hicimos las jornadas y son en estos 4 ejes: laicidad, democracia representativa y nuevas formas de participación, pobreza y desigualdad extrema y emergencia climática, en algo que llamamos constitucionalismo en transformación prospectiva 2030, que es el análisis de cómo será el constitucionalismo, cuáles serían los dilemas o los retos para de aquí a 10 años, ¿no? Estamos ahora en el COVID, la pandemia, toda la emergencia climática, los problemas de desigualdad que se van acrecentando y los otros 2 ejes, laicidad, democracia, que también son importantes. Y vamos a ver un video del profesor Pedro Pablo Vanegas sobre el eje de democracia, si lo podemos mostrar. Hay un micrositio para que exploren, es gratis, va a ser un gran evento con muchos invitados internacionales. No se oye, ¿verdad?
No.
Vamos a intentar, voy a ponerlo desde mi Zoom. Vamos a ver.
¿O podemos
Sí,
compartir el link por el chat?
Sí, puede ser así. También, si quiere, compartimos el link por el chat, porque está muy pesada por ahora la red. Y de esa manera pueden ver todos el video. Sí, porque está como pesado. Bueno, los invitamos para la próxima sesión. Va a ser el profesor Joel Colón Ríos, del profesor de Nueva Zelanda, que nos va a presentar su libro sobre poder constituyente, y eso será el próximo lunes a las 4 de la tarde. Estos horarios son excepcionales porque pues finalmente los profesores, pues sus horarios son mucho más difíciles que a las 6 de la tarde, como cuando usualmente hacemos estos seminarios. Entonces, pues va a ser lunes a las 4 de la tarde y va a comentar la profesora Mariana Velázquez sobre este nuevo libro de Joel Colón. Todos invitados y los dejamos. Thank you, Yaniv. Thank you, Maria Camila, for the translation. Everybody, goodbye. See you on Monday.
Hasta pronto, adiós.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.